Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com. In this tutorial, we're going to look at passing values to functions. So here I've got the code from the last tutorial, and I'm going to start actually by changing this because one thing I forgot to do in the last tutorial was rename this function. This function that we created it's called process selection, but it's actually just getting user input, and the selection is processed down here. So I could just rename it by hand, but let's use an Eclipse shortcut, which is very handy if you've got a lot of calls to the same function, because you can call them repeatedly. That's part of the idea, and you're not sure where they all are. So let's just right click this function, select it, and right click and go to refactor, rename, and I'm going to give it a new name. So I'm going to call it, type in here, get input. And you'll notice Eclipse has renamed this for me as well. Now I'd like to split this code off into its own function. So I'd like main to just consist of 3 function calls: show menu, get input, and process selection. But at the moment, the problem there is we get the selection here, and then we have no way of passing it to a function that then processes the input. Let's have a look at how we can do that. So I'm going to type here void process, let's call it process selection, process input, it doesn't really matter, process selection. And I'm going to take this switch statement here, I'm going to cut it like this, paste it in process selection. And so the problem we have now is that the selection variable here, which is it's the user input that we get here from here, is not available in process selection. And to make it available, we can type stuff in these round brackets here. So we want to pass an integer to process selection, and I'm going to type here int selection in these round brackets. And now in the main function, I can type process selection just as before with round brackets, because it's a function call, and we need to have the round brackets when we call a function, as we have here and here and here. But now I'm going to just type in these round brackets selection. So the changes we've made are just we're putting the integer value that we want to pass into these round brackets here when we call the function, and we've changed the function here so that in its round brackets it says int selection. This is actually declaring a variable, and we call this passing a variable. And when we pass the variable, we're actually copying the value in this variable here. We're copying it into this new variable here. So this int selection, it's not the same as this. Again, it's a completely different variable, and the scope of this variable is these curly brackets, while the scope of this variable is these curly brackets. So as we're returning, we're actually creating a completely new variable, and we're copying the value of this variable into this variable, and they don't have to be named the same either. So we could call this something completely different. Let's do that option. So if I was writing this program just for myself, I'd probably call this and this and this. I'd call them all input because I'm well aware that those are completely different variables, but because I don't want to confuse you here, I'm going to give them all different names. So this int option receives the value from selection here, and it's a bit like throwing a value down a chute. So you can think of this as a chute, and here we're throwing the value of this variable down the chute, and here we receive it in the value option. And option, it has the right size to receive that value. So we're sending an int down the chute, so to speak. We're passing the function an int, and the function parameter also has type int, so it can receive that value. We can copy that value into it. So now our main function looks really simple, and it shows you exactly what's going on. We're showing the menu, we're getting user input here, and then we're processing the user input. Here we're processing the selection that the user made. Let's just try that and check that it works. So I'm going to run this, and when it finally builds and runs, let's enter a selection, let's say 1, and it says searching because it's executing case 1 here. So that's it for this tutorial. In the next tutorial we're probably going to look at passing multiple values to functions, but to practice this, again I'd suggest taking the tutorial, the project from the last tutorial and creating this new function. Try to do it without referring back to this source code, but if you get stuck, refer back, but try to do it as much as possible from memory. And equally, if you've written some other program, just try to declare a function that accepts some kind of variable. You could return stuff from functions as well as passing stuff to them, so it's not a problem combining this kind of thing with this kind of thing. You can do that. And in the next tutorial we'll look at passing multiple values to functions. So that's it for this time, and until next time, happy coding.